All right, so we're going deep on fascism today. Between the wars, like how it took over Europe and set things up for World War II.
Yeah,
We've got a whole bunch of stuff here, speeches and all that, to give us the picture. This is going to be heavy.
it is.
Let's get into it.
You can't just look at fascism like it came out of nowhere. You got to rewind a bit back to after World War One.
Right.
Europe was a mess, democracy's weak, economy's a disaster,
Yeah.
and then the Treaty of Versailles. Meant to punish Germany, but it had some serious consequences they didn't intend.
The treaty gets blamed a lot for helping fascism rise, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It redrew the map of Europe, ignoring all these ethnic and cultural ties that already existed.
Oh, wow.
So resentment, instability, especially in Germany. They felt totally humiliated, perfect for extreme movements to pop up.
And fascism, I guess, promised to make things great again.
Exactly. National revival, back to glory. That appealed to a lot of people.
So we've got this chaos and resentment. But what high is fascism, really? We hear it all the time, but what does it actually mean?
Great question. It's more than just politics. It's a whole way of thinking.
Okay.
Anti-democratic, top-down, no individual liberty. The state's above everything. They believe in a single, all-powerful leader and using force to get what they want.
You know, one thing that stuck out in the sources was the thing about wanting a glorious past. It seems to go along with hating certain groups,
Oh, yeah.
almost like an international thing, uniting fascists across countries.
That's spot on. Fascism needs division, needs an enemy, someone to blame.
Right.
Could be a minority group, religious group, anyone who disagrees with them.
Makes sense. So we've got our definition. Now let's look at how it played out. One source pointed to Italy with Mussolini and his black shirts back in the 1920s.
Right. Italy was like the first experiment for fascist ideas.
Okay.
Mussolini, he'd been a socialist before, but he used all that turmoil after the war to grab power.
And I guess people were desperate enough to believe him.
He promised to fix everything. Restore pride, make Italy great again.
It's scary how many different people supported him. These black shirts weren't just random thugs.
No, they weren't.
Industrialists, landowners, even a famous poet was backing them.
Mussolini was a master at propaganda, charismatic leader. He tapped into people's fear, promising them safety when everything was uncertain.
Right.
And it resonated, especially with those who felt left behind by the old system.
One thing that's always struck me about Mussolini was he actually got the economy kind of stable, at least for a bit.
Right.
One source talked about his corporatist policies, where the state basically ran industries and unions.
Yeah, his corporatist system did give the Italian economy a temporary boost. He got rid of strikes, got businesses and the government working together, brought down unemployment, increased production.
So was that like a legit success, or were there downsides?
Well, yeah, it had some short-term gains, but at a big cost.
Okay.
No freedom. Anyone who disagreed was silenced. The state controlled more and more of people's lives.
So Mussolini was all about action, taking power and enacting his vision quickly. Yeah.
But then we go to Germany, where Hitler was much slower and more deliberate in building his movement.
Right. And this is where things get more complex. Mussolini was driven by power, but Hitler, he was a true believer,
Okay.
consumed by racism and anti-Semitism. His book, Mein Kampf, it's basically his twisted plan laid out for everyone to see.
And to think, Hitler wasn't successful at first.
Yeah.
Like that whole beer hall putsch thing was a failure.
Yeah, but Hitler was resilient,
Huh.
learned from his mistakes, got better at propaganda, waited for the right time to strike,
Yeah.
and then the Great Depression gave him exactly what he needed.
Wow.
The economy was a disaster, people were desperate. Add to that the anger from the Versailles Treaty.
So that's where Hitler's ideas about national revival and racial purity started to resonate.
Yeah, he blamed the Jews, the communists, anyone he could for Germany's problems,
Right.
and offered a simple solution. Back to a mythical greatness, a 1,000-year Reich, where the Aryan race would rule.
One of the sources really dug into this Lebensraum concept. Oh yeah, Lebensraum, living space, key to Nazi ideology.
Well,
Justification for expansion, for aggression. They argued that Germans needed more land to fulfill their destiny.
wow.
Deeply rooted in nationalism and a huge part of Hitler's goals.
It's chilling to see how this twisted thinking took shape, and the world just ignored it.
There were some warnings, definitely. Intellectuals, journalists, a few politicians saw the danger.
Really?
But they were drowned out by apathy, fear, and wishful thinking.
I guess after World War I, nobody wanted another war. The trauma was still so raw.
Exactly. And the Depression made it even harder.
Right.
People struggling to survive are more likely to turn to extreme ideas. Fascism offered hope, even if it was a false hope built on hate.
It's like they were so desperate for a solution, any solution, they just ignored the warning signs.
Right, and remember, this wasn't just about Hitler and Mussolini.
Okay.
They were able to take advantage of existing problems, social divisions, anxieties about the economy, cultural change, all that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You mentioned scapegoating before. It's terrifying how they targeted certain groups to gain power.
Absolutely. They created an us versus them mentality,
Yeah.
and that became the foundation of their whole ideology.
And this wasn't just Italy and Germany, right?
No, not at all. Fascism was international. Movements popping up in Spain, Portugal, Romania.
Mhm.
It appealed to the sense of resentment and nationalism,
Yeah.
promised to return to some golden age, national pride restored.
So we've talked about the causes, how it spread.
Right.
What about the consequences? Why was it so dangerous?
Well, aside from the horrors of World War II, which we'll get to,
Yeah.
fascism destroyed individual lives and whole societies.
Oh, right.
Democracy crumbled, dissent was crushed, violence and persecution were everywhere.
The Holocaust is probably the most obvious example, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The systematic murder of millions of Jews and other minorities. It shows what happens when hatred and intolerance are allowed to run wild. It wasn't just about conquering land. It was about reshaping the world according to their beliefs, eliminating anyone who didn't fit in.
And the Holocaust wasn't the only atrocity, right?
No. Political murders, torture, imprisonment without trial, no free speech, anything resembling freedom or individual rights was systematically dismantled.
Wow.
The human cost of fascism is impossible to measure. And it makes us ask, how could Europe, just after World War I, go back to such barbarity?
It's like they went through hell and then ended up right back there again.
A big factor was that the peace after World War I didn't fix the underlying problems. Economic instability, political extremism, national grievances. None of that was truly resolved.
So it was like a wound that never healed properly.
Exactly. And the democracies, weakened by their own problems and afraid to confront aggression, they let the situation get worse.
It's like they thought they could reason with dictators. Give them a little of what they wanted and it'll all be fine.
That was the idea behind appeasement. But it was tragically naive. Hitler's ambition had no limits. Every concession just made him bolder.
It's a scary reminder of how dangerous complacency can be. You can't just ignore extremism and hope it'll go away.
You're right, and that's a lesson that's maybe even more important today than ever before.
How so?
Fascism as a major force was defeated in World War II, yes. But the things that allowed it to grow, economic hardship, political division, fear of others, that's all still around today.
Wow.
It's just changed, adapted to fit the times.
So you're saying we could see fascism come back in the 21st century?
I wouldn't say it's guaranteed, but the potential is definitely there. The seeds of fascism are always present, waiting for the right moment to grow. We have to be able to see those conditions, challenge extremist ideas, and defend democratic values.
Yeah.
We can't take them for granted.
It's like studying a disease, right?
Yeah.
If you understand how it spreads, you can stop it from happening again.
Absolutely. By looking at the rise and fall of fascism, we're not just learning about the past. We're learning how to deal with the present and the future.
Okay, so let's move on to how we got to war. How did all this tension turn into a global conflict? One big turning point must have been the Spanish Civil War, right? That started in 1936.
Oh, the Spanish Civil War was a tragedy.
Yeah.
Brother against brother, a proxy war between fascism and democracy. Germany and Italy backing Franco's fascists, the Soviets helping the Republicans.
It was like a testing ground for the fascists, right?
Right.
To try out new weapons and tactics.
Exactly. It was a preview of the horrors that were coming in World War II.
And again, the democracies just stood back and watched. Didn't get involved.
Yeah. Partly because they didn't want another war, but also because they didn't really understand the threat.
And with Hitler, appeasement definitely didn't work. He just kept pushing further and further.
He was testing the limits, seeing how much he could get away with.
Like a game of chicken with the whole world.
Yeah. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, breaking the Treaty of Versailles. Everyone protested, but nobody did anything. So, feeling confident, he got even more aggressive.
So they kept giving him little pieces of what he wanted, thinking he'd eventually be satisfied.
That was the thinking, but it was a fatal mistake.
Yeah,
Hitler's hunger for conquest was never ending.
right.
He saw every concession as weakness and just wanted more.
Then in 1938, he took Austria, another aggressive move.
And again, the world condemned it, but did nothing to stop it.
It's crazy how long this went on.
Then in 1939, he set his sights on Czechoslovakia. wanted the Sudetenland, a region with lots of Germans.
Oh, yeah, that was a close call, wasn't it?
The Sudetenland crisis almost started the war.
Eh.
Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, flew to Munich to meet Hitler, trying to find a peaceful solution.
And that's where they agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland,
The
right?
Munich Agreement. Seen as the ultimate failure of appeasement, it showed Hitler that the democracies were weak and wouldn't fight back.
And of course, he broke his promises just a few months later and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia.
In March 1939, it was a wake-up call for the democracy.
But way too late.
They finally realized Hitler couldn't be trusted. His ambition was limitless, and he would use force to get what he wanted.
So now we're really on the road to war. But there's one more thing that happens before it actually starts.
And that's the alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right?
Yeah, in August 1939. Shocked the world.
Yeah, I bet. These two completely opposite ideologies suddenly making a deal.
It was a brilliant move for Hitler. He neutralized the threat from the Soviets so he could focus on conquering Poland without worrying about a war on two fronts.
And Stalin got some time to rebuild his military and expand his territory.
It was a purely strategic alliance, but it had terrible consequences for everyone else.
Because just a week after the pact was signed, Hitler invaded Poland.
And that was the start of World War II.
And the world was plunged into another global conflict, one that would kill millions and change the world forever.
It's like you see this train wreck coming,
Yeah.
but nobody can stop it.
It's hard to understand how the world just watched as fascism grew. Didn't anyone see the danger?
Oh, some people did. Intellectuals, some journalists, even a few politicians. They were speaking out.
Really?
But nobody listened. There was too much, apathy, fear.
Hope that it would just go away on its own.
Yeah, maybe. And don't forget, the Great Depression was happening too.
Right.
When people are just trying to survive, they'll grab onto any solution, even extreme ones.
Fascism offered hope, I guess, even if it was based on hate.
It did. And remember, it wasn't just about these charismatic leaders.
Like Hitler and Mussolini.
Yeah. They exploited what was already there.
Mm-hmm.
Social divisions,
Yeah.
anxieties about the economy, cultural shifts.
So they didn't create the problems, they just took advantage of them.
Exactly. We talked about scapegoating earlier. It's scary how they targeted certain groups to get more power.
It's like they needed an enemy, right, to make people afraid.
They had to create this us versus them idea. It's a hallmark of fascism, really.
And it wasn't limited to just Italy and Germany either.
Nope. Fascism was everywhere. Movements were gaining traction in Spain, Portugal, Romania.
Wow.
It appealed to this deep feeling of grievance and nationalism that went beyond borders.
That was like a global trend.
Yeah, kind of. It promised this return to a glorious past, national pride and power restored.
Okay, so we know the causes, we know how it spread. But what about the consequences? What made fascism so dangerous?
Well, besides World War II, which we'll talk about, it had a devastating impact on people's lives, on whole societies.
Right.
Democratic institutions were eroded, dissent was suppressed, and violence and persecution were rampant.
The Holocaust is the most obvious example of that, I guess.
Definitely. The systematic extermination of millions of Jews and other minorities. It's a chilling reminder of what can happen when hatred and intolerance are given free rein.
It's hard to comprehend that level of cruelty.
It really is. And it wasn't just about conquering territory. It was about reshaping the world in their image, wiping out anyone they considered undesirable.
So the Holocaust wasn't the only horrific act?
Oh, no, not at all. There were political assassinations, torture, imprisonment without trial, suppression of free speech, and the press. They systematically dismantled anything that even resembled freedom or individual rights.
It's mind-boggling how much damage they caused.
The human cost of fascism is immeasurable.
Yeah.
And it forces us to ask, how could Europe, just after World War I, fall back into such barbarity?
It's like they went through one nightmare and then walked straight into another.
A key factor was that the peace settlement after World War I didn't really solve the underlying problems. Economic instability, political extremism, unresolved national grievances.
So they were never really dealt with.
Right? And they became fertile ground for fascism to take hold. And the democracies, weakened by their own internal divisions and their reluctance to confront aggression.
They just hoped it would all work out somehow.
Yeah, pretty much. They hoped that appeasement would work, that they could reason with these dictators.
Well, we know that didn't work.
It was a disastrously naive approach.
So it's a powerful reminder that we can't be complacent. We have to be vigilant and actively resist extremism.
Absolutely. And that's a lesson that might be even more relevant today than ever before. While fascism as a dominant political force was defeated in World War II, the conditions that allowed it to flourish, economic hardship, political polarization, fear of the other, those conditions are still around.
Oh, wow.
They've just morphed and adapted to the times.
So are you saying we could see a resurgence of fascism in the 21st century?
I'm not saying it's inevitable, but the possibility is there. The seeds of fascism are always present, just waiting for the right conditions to germinate. And it's our responsibility to be aware of those conditions, to challenge extremist ideologies, and to stand up for democratic values.
It's like if you understand how a disease spreads,
Yeah,
you can stop it from happening again.
exactly. By studying the rise and fall of fascism, we're not just looking back at the past. We're equipping ourselves to face the challenges of the present and the future.
So let's shift gears and talk about that road to war. How did we go from these simmering tensions to a full-blown global conflict? I mean, one turning point had to be the Spanish Civil War, right? That started in 1936.
The Spanish Civil War was just a tragedy on so many levels. It was a brutal conflict that pitted brother against brother, and it became a proxy war between fascism and democracy, with Germany and Italy backing Franco's fascist forces.
And the Soviet Union was aiding the Republicans.
Right. It was a chance for the fascist powers to test out their new weapons and tactics, and it was a foreshadowing of the horrors that were to come in World War II.
And the democracies, again, mostly stayed out of it.
Yeah. This policy of non-intervention was partly because they wanted to avoid another major war, but it also reflected a certain amount of complacency and a failure to really grasp how dangerous fascism was.
This appeasement strategy didn't work at all with Hitler. He just kept pushing the boundaries, seeing what he could get away with.
It's exactly. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland, which is a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The world protested, but no one took any real action.
So he got bolder.
Absolutely. Emboldened by his success, Hitler became even more aggressive.
It's almost as if he was daring them to stop him.
That's a good way to put it. And then in 1938 came the annexation of Austria, which was another blatant act of aggression.
And the world's response.
They condemned it, but no one was willing to risk a war to stop it.
So they kept thinking they could give him a little bit of what he wanted and he'd eventually be satisfied.
That was the idea behind appeasement, but it turned out to be a fatal miscalculation. Hitler's desire for conquest was insatiable. He interpreted every concession as a sign of weakness, and it only encouraged him to demand more.
And then in 1939, he decided he wanted Czechoslovakia, demanding the Sudetenland.
Right, the Sudetenland, which had a large German population. This crisis brought Europe to the edge of war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to meet with Hitler, desperately hoping to negotiate a peaceful solution.
And that meeting led to the Munich Agreement, right?
Exactly. Britain and France, in a desperate attempt to avoid war, basically gave Hitler what he wanted.
It didn't work, did it?
The Munich Agreement is often seen as the ultimate failure of appeasement. It just showed Hitler that the democracies were weak and wouldn't stand up to him. And of course, just a few months later, in March of 1939, Hitler went ahead and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia.
So appeasement was a complete failure.
It was. The invasion of Czechoslovakia was a wake-up call for the democracies, but it came too late. They finally realized that Hitler couldn't be trusted, that his ambitions had no boundaries, and that he was willing to use force to achieve them.
So the world was on the brink of war. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that falls into place before the conflict actually breaks out.
And that piece is the alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Yes, signed in August of 1939. It shocked the world.
I can imagine. These two regimes with totally opposite ideologies suddenly decided to sign a non-aggression pact.
It was a stroke of genius for Hitler. It neutralized the threat from the Soviet Union, allowing him to conquer Poland without worrying about a war on two fronts.
And for Stalin, I guess it gave him time to build up his military and take more territory.
Right. It was a cynical alliance born out of convenience, but it had terrible consequences for the world.
Because just a week after the pact was signed, Hitler invaded Poland.
And that was the beginning of World War II.
And the world was thrown into another global conflict, a war that would cost millions of lives and change the course of history. Wow, it's just incredible, the sheer scale of it all. World War II, I mean. And to think these fascist regimes with these awful ideologies, how could they do so much damage?
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder of what happens when unchecked ambition and hate are allowed to fester. When the world doesn't stand up to aggression, the price of inaction, millions of lives lost. It's a lot to process.
We've really gone deep here, haven't we? From the aftermath of World War I that set the stage for fascism to these chilling ideologies that drove it and the disastrous consequences of appeasement.
We have. It's been a heavy conversation for sure.
But even in all this darkness, there's got to be some glimmer of hope, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, but
I
yeah.
mean, the Allies winning World War II showed that even when things seem impossible, tyranny can be defeated.
Right.
It also showed how important it is for countries to work together to protect peace and freedom.
You said earlier that the seeds of fascism are always around, waiting for the right moment. That's a scary thought. So what can we learn from all this? How do we prevent something like this from happening again?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we have to protect democratic values. You know, free speech, a free press, the rule of law, human
It's
rights.
basics, yeah.
Exactly. Those are the foundations of a just society. And
Yeah.
they don't just maintain themselves. We have to actively work to keep them strong.
It's like if you don't use a muscle, it gets weak.
That's a good analogy. We can't just assume everything will be okay. We have to participate in our democracies, hold our leaders accountable, speak up against injustice.
And be wary of anyone who uses fear and division to get ahead.
Absolutely. Populist rhetoric, scapegoating, demonizing the other,
Yeah.
those are all red flags.
We have to think critically, question what we hear, look for different perspectives.
Yes. And not fall for easy answers to complex problems.
Like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. And
Right.
studying history isn't just about, memorizing dates.
Right.
It's about understanding why people made the choices they did, what influenced them, what the consequences were.
So we can see the patterns, the warning signs, and break the cycle.
Yes. And the fight for freedom and democracy, it never really ends. We have to stay vigilant, all of us.
So understanding how fascism rose and fell, it's not just about the past. It's about being prepared for what might come in the future.
Exactly. By learning from the mistakes of history, hopefully, we can prevent the horrors of fascism from ever happening again.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the rise of fascism. It's been, well, a lot to take in, but it's so important to learn about these things, so we can make sure those dark days never come back. Keep learning, keep asking questions, keep exploring.